All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton, and that's the Descendants playing rock and roll in the background there. This is the Limited Temporary Constitutional Republic Broadcasting Network, and I want to say thank you to all the support that I get in my email box. I appreciate all you people letting me know that you like the show out there. Anybody wants to send me mail, pro or con, you can get me at scott@weekendinterviewshow.com or scott@antiwar.com. And keep all the archives at weekendinterviewshow.com if anybody wants to give a listen there. I'd like to go ahead and introduce my second guest today. His name is Tom Barry. He's the co-founder and policy director for the International Relations Center and has written a ton of books and articles. You can look him up at irc-online.org. Welcome back to the show, Mr. Barry.
Thank you.
Great to talk to you again. Now, when Mr. Robert Zoellick was made the Deputy Secretary of State, a lot of people breathed a sigh of relief because everyone was afraid that John Bolton, who had been the Deputy Secretary of State for, I forget exactly his position now, for arms control, right? For arms control and international security. Everybody was scared he was going to be promoted to Deputy Secretary of State, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief when it was Robert Zoellick instead. Only now John Bolton's been made the ambassador to the United Nations.
Right. Well, it has to go through an approval process first.
Right. He's just nominated for now. And does it look like he's probably got pretty good chances of being confirmed by the Senate?
Well, it's going to be tough, but for him, I think it's going to be some heated hearing process. But the Democrats are not entirely united against Bolton. When he was nominated for Undersecretary of Arms Control, 7 Democrats voted in his favor. So he was confirmed, and it's likely that he'll be confirmed again.
Tell us a little bit about this guy's background. He's such a warmonger. I have to say I was shocked to find out that he's not an ex-communist.
Yeah, he doesn't come from the neoconservative tradition. He wouldn't identify himself as a neoconservative. He started out as, in his college days, a supporter of Goldwater campaign aid, volunteer campaign aid in the Goldwater campaign. So he's been on the right side of the political spectrum since his youth, and he has worked in the Republican Party, been a Republican Party loyalist, been associated with Strom Thurmond and a couple of his campaigns, and then worked in both the Justice Department and the Defense Department during the Reagan administration.
It's interesting that during the 1990s he became so closely tied with the neoconservatives. I know he had positions at the American Enterprise Institute and the Project for New American Century, right?
Right, and the Manhattan Institute. Yes, there has been this convergence in the traditional right and the neoconservatives around the United Nations. And of course, it's been the traditional conservatives who have long opposed the United Nations since it was founded as a global government that would take over the United States, the Blue Helmets, fear of the Blue Helmets, and so on. That came from the traditional right. The neoconservatives allied with the traditional right around those issues in the 70s.
Yep, that's a very interesting spot to pick this interview up when we get back from this break. I'm Scott Horton. We're talking with Tom Barry. He's the co-founder of and policy director for the International Relations Center. We'll be right back. Hey everybody, I'm Scott Horton, host of the Weekend Interview Show, and I'm talking with Tom Barry from the International Relations Center. We're talking about John Bolton, and before the break, sir, you were mentioning about the convergence of the regular conservatives or paleo-conservatives, or, well, maybe not the paleos, but I guess your run-of-the-mill conservatives and your and your neocons around the UN, right?
Yes.
They both share this disdain for the United Nations. Now, myself, I'm a libertarian, and I have a particular disdain for the UN myself, only it seems to me that the neocon argument against the UN and the typical libertarian or conservative argument against the UN are complete opposite arguments, are they not?
Well, I don't know. You're the libertarian, so...
Well, let me put it this way. In my point of view, and in the traditional right-wing criticism of the UN that I'm familiar with, the problem with the UN is that they turn tiny little brush fire wars into everybody's business, and that they're an embryonic world state. It would, of course, like to be more and more powerful, and it gets our country into a bunch of trouble that we could better avoid by being independent and at peace. Whereas the John Bolton argument is clearly that they don't like the UN because it's in their way, because it's slowing them down as they're trying to kill as many people as they can. Yes,
I think that's certainly true for Bolton, although the neoconservatives and John Bolton himself have a little more nuanced policy in that, yes, that they would like to get rid of the United Nations, but at the same time, they've backtracked a little bit from that, and now it's to use the United Nations as an instrument of U.S. power, and so that they've worked more closely with the United Nations. John Bolton himself has received money from the United Nations, and worked on an assistant to Jim Baker in the Western Sahara, channeled money to a conservative committee, UN money to a conservative committee. So when they can, they like to use the United Nations for their own purposes.
So that really is the traditional conservative critique of the UN upside down.
Yes, indeed, and that they do not believe, and that's probably the same with the libertarian critique in the collective security argument for the United Nations, that you need an international forum to respond to threats to security. That's why the United Nations was founded in the wake of World War II, to try to prevent those kind of conflicts from occurring again.
Right. Well, and for myself, speaking for my own self, anyway, I'd be for the UN if that's really what it was a place where people got together to sort of work things out. However, I think the collective security arrangement really guarantees that nation states that really have nothing to do with any given conflict become automatically part of the conflict.
That's not what a neoconservative critique, as you pointed out, that they're mostly concerned that it stands in the way of the United States. Indeed, that they would like the UN support. For example, as they tried to do in the last moment in Iraq, UN support for U.S. interventionism around the world.
So, what are the traditional diplomatic core, foreign policy elite in America? What do they think about John Bolton moving to this position?
Well, they're horrified. That John Bolton has been the kind of the leading attack dog against the United Nations for a couple of decades. That he's very outspoken, shrill, but intelligent. I mean, he cannot be written off. That Condoleezza Rice, in announcing the nomination, said that he was a man who can get things done, and that's part of the fear of John Bolton. That he's intelligent, he knows international law, he knows the UN. He's been working on these issues for some time. He can do some damage.
They call him the treaty killer, right? Which treaties have he killed?
Well, he actually signaled the way the Bush administration was going in what I would categorize as aggressive anti-multilateralism and its unilateral interventionist approach. That from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, International Criminal Court, the Bioweapons Convention, you name it, he's against it, and has succeeded in with either ending treaties or withdrawing United.
Let me ask you a sec there. Let me stop you at the International Criminal Court, because my understanding is basically that they didn't really unsign the treaty as much as they sort of worked a compromise where they would have temporary immunity from it, right?
No, the Clinton administration, President Clinton, signed the treaty in his last several weeks, I think, in office. That Bolton signed a letter withdrawing that signature, that approval. But what they've done, and I think that what you're referring to, is to ensure that other countries do not participate in the treaty itself. They what they call I think it's called Article 48 agreements that the United States has with a number of countries, where they explicitly agreed that they would not participate in any decision that would bring U.S. citizens to any kind of judgment for human rights abuses. And if these countries do not sign these agreements with the United States, they do not have a chance of getting U.S. military aid.
I see. It seems like kind of a common, like a running theme here, where America is the enforcer of international law on everyone else, but it doesn't apply to us.
Well, yes, I mean that's the critique, but it's not a critique that has to be made by critics of John Bolton or the administration. That John Bolton himself will say exactly that the United States is above international law. Only the United States is above international law. The United States is the only country with the moral right to act outside of the boundaries of international norms and conventions, because we're the only free country. We're the only country that has the kind of constitution that we have. The Constitution is the only law that should regulate the United States, whereas other nations have to respect these norms that the United States is free from.
Yeah, well, and it really makes me look pretty bad. And the people who traditionally have been against international law, not in like the old, basic laws of warfare, Geneva Convention sense, but in all the new widening and deepening of international regulatory bodies across the board, they've really turned our argument upside down and made it seem like the only criticism out there of the United Nations is that they're not willing and able to do our dirty work enough. When, I'm sitting here trying to argue for independence and peace. Seems like, from my point of view, a couple of false opposites. We can either intervene with the help of the Germans and the French, or we can intervene without their help.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, indeed. That Bolton is a treaty killer, and will do his best to undermine all aspects of the United Nations. When asked what a UN Security Council should be, you said, Scott, that if it were just collective security, that you'd probably favor the United Nations. Well, the UN Security Council deals with security issues.
What I said was I would be for it if it was just a place for them to get together and talk, not necessarily to write a resolution about what they're going to do.
I see. Well, the Security Council, yes, does deal with collective security issues, and Bolton, according to Bolton, if there were a Security Council, it should be just with one member, and that would be the United States. So he's rather outspoken.
Pardon me if this sounds like a parody. I mean, come on. There should only be one member of the Security Council, the U.S. I mean, who else in the world is going to go along with a UN like that?
He believes, as do the neoconservatives, that like it or not, the world has to go along with the United States because we are the supreme military power. We're the only country with the political will to intervene around the world when we think it's, whether it's to protect our economic interest or national security, or whether it is just to maintain international peace and stability. We are the only country that has that political will to intervene, and therefore the other countries have to fall in line, like it or not.
Well, speaking of that will, this guy Bolton, while at the State Department, was doing everything he could to try to pick a fight with Iran. I know from reading Gordon Prather, who writes for antiwar.com,
right,
that no matter what El Baradei and the IAEA say about the level of cooperation of the Iranians, this guy Bolton is the one particularly, in fact, I think, isn't it Bolton that they sent there to be the quote-unquote leash on Colin Powell in the first place? He's the one undermining every tiny bit of progress that could possibly be made in negotiating with Iran. And it seems like perhaps sticking him in the ambassador to the UN spot is just a setup on the way of playing that same script against Iran that they did against Iraq, which is the UN Security Council won't do anything about it, so we're being forced to intervene unilaterally. And it seems like they're playing that same script again. I'm Scott. The guest is Tom Barry. We're talking about neocons and the United Nations. Stay tuned. All right, my friends, welcome back to the show. I'm Scott, and my guest is Tom Barry.
Yeah, Scott, you're talking about Iran. I think that you're right in looking, we should look at the statements of John Bolton in the past as a way of signaling what is the agenda of the administration. And it's certainly focused on Middle East, but John Bolton has, again, like the old guard conservatives, had a strong focus on East Asia, that he is picking fights, and where he would like to pick a fight is with China, and he's been wanting to take a more confrontational stance with China, and that was also seen in his views on North Korea and negotiating with North Korea. You mentioned that he was a leash for Colin Powell, and Colin Powell suggested that we continue a framework negotiations with North Korea. The next day, Bolton and the administration said no. So we want to look at North Korea, China. Bolton, even before the intervention in Iraq, was meeting with the Israelis, the Prime Minister Sharon and former Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying that after Iraq, we're going to go down the line. It's going to be Iran, Syria, Libya, and then later on he added Cuba and North Korea.
Right. Yeah, accused Cuba of making biological weapons. Right.
Yes, with absolutely no evidence, and that's been part of the strategy. He knows well that there is no evidence that Cuba's health industry is producing bioweapons, but it's that they have no need to produce evidence. When Congress called him in front of the committee to testify on that, he refused to come. That there is no evidence for it, but yet. This categorization of countries as threats to the United States without evidence is symptomatic of what we've seen in the...
well, they don't have to be a threat. They just have to be an outpost of tyranny, right? That's good enough.
Yeah, that's right.
Let me ask you about the China thing. You brought up China there, and, I know that there are a lot of hawks on the right who, have a very suspicious and prefer a very confrontational approach to China. But let's be real. For a second, this is the United States of America where billionaires rule. And are the billionaires really going to let a bunch of crazies take us to war against China? I mean, are there not economic interests that are going to trump the ideological interests of these crazies?
Well, I hope we don't have to see how that plays out. If indeed Bolton has been very supportive and working with Taiwan's government to encourage them to declare independence from China. That China, it's certainly not in China's interest either to go to war with the United States, but it's part of their nationalism that they can, and their credibility to their own people. If they let Taiwan go independent, they would have to, I think, go after Taiwan, and then it would be hard to say if what the United States would do, but I think that the United States would intervene. That would be crazy. It wouldn't be for the benefit of either China or the United States or the entire world, but it could come to that.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but it's just like Lou Rockwell said, it's a heck of a note to have to root for the Rockefellers. But I'm serious. I want a banker to put his foot down, like, immediately before these people get us all killed. China has hydrogen bombs, and they have the very best American technology to deliver those hydrogen bombs.
Well, yes, they do have the possibility of reaching California, but that China does not have imperial ambitions. That it's doing fine. It's slowly building good relations in the region. That its main threat to the United States is, and I believe really the only threat to the United States is an economic threat that that the United States does need to be concerned about. Not because that it will overtake the United States, just that the United States needs to be concerned about its own workers, its own economy, and by paying attention, by being overly concerned with these outposts of tyranny and not paying attention to economic problems here at home, the country is declining.
Well, I hate to say it. I got about 2.5, 3 hours worth of questions for you here. There's no way we're going to be able to get to it all, but I think we should move on to Paul Wolfowitz here a little bit. I wonder whether you think he was promoted or kicked upstairs to the World Bank. Well, he
didn't get. He would like to be Secretary of Defense. That's not possible. That he probably would not be confirmed in the Senate. So that not being able to move upstairs, that I think that he sees a better route for himself, being the president of the World Bank, where he can exercise more independence, and so it's a little bit of both.
You know, Jude Winniski wrote in his memo on the margin that this guy Wolfowitz has absolutely no experience in finance whatsoever. There's no qualification that he holds that would indicate that he ought to be a banker for a living.
That's right. There are some arguments that we had a former Defense Department executive, Robert McNamara, became World Bank.
And to great success. The whole world still remembers him so fondly for that. All right, hang tight right there, Tom. We got to go out to break. We'll be right back on the Weekend Interview Show with Tom Barry. All right, guys, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and I'm talking with Tom Barry. He's co-founder of and policy director for the International Relations Center. And, today is the second anniversary of the beginning of the re-invasion of Iraq. And I wondered, Mr. Barry, do you think that there's even the slightest chance that Paul Wolfowitz could be as dangerous to life and liberty at the World Bank as he has been at the Department of Defense?
No, I think he's done his damage. The damage in terms of the World Bank will the World Bank has regained some of its credibility and its legitimacy. And
they're using you two for public relations?
No, it's that compared to the IMF, for example, that the World Bank has stepped back from its policies of what they call the Washington Consensus. It's not such a ardent advocate of that kind of economic restructuring, and in doing so has regained some of its credibility with member countries affected by those policies. With Wolfowitz there, it's basically his nomination, like the Bolton nomination, is throwing down the gauntlet with the Europeans, and it's an insult, and to them, it'll be interesting to see if they put up a fight. I think that he will. The United States has the privilege of naming the president of the World Bank, and it would only be in a strong, unified disapproval of European countries that it could be stopped.
Interesting that Bush seems so intent on giving Europe the middle finger when it comes to Wolfowitz and to John Bolton, and yet at the same time, I mean, honestly, we're talking about, at least in terms of Paul Wolfowitz leaving defense. I know Feith is fired effective this summer. Seems like perhaps the Department of Defense will be not so much under the control of the neoconservatives after this.
I mean, Rumsfeld is not a neoconservative. Vice President Cheney is not a neoconservative. The neoconservatives were useful to what I would call the militarists in defining an agenda around which to unify U.S. foreign and military policy. Neoconservatives are articulate, good writers. They have an ideology, and that has worked well for people like Cheney and Rumsfeld. With that agenda now well defined, that it's just a matter of moving forward with it to justify further increases in the military budget, other interventions against the axis of evil countries. It's the fact that Feith is leaving and Wolfowitz is going to the World Bank, I don't think signals a change in the administration's foreign and military policy.
Well, and they still have Scooter Libby in the Vice President's office and Elliot Abrams on the National Security Council,
yes,
right?
And certainly, the appointment of I think Elliot Abrams was significant, and that was the major initiative announced by Bush in the inaugural address of this democracy initiative, with Abrams, the neoconservative, appointed to head that initiative and also continue as the main Middle East advisor. Was another sign that Bush is not backing away from this radical agenda.
You mentioned before when you're talking about John Bolton and how he was confirmed by the Senate the first time. I think you said 7 Democrats voted for him, which brings up the I guess you've written all about this a few times, of the alliance between the neoconservatives and the liberal hawks, whereas, like you just said, the neocons are useful for articulating a policy that people like Cheney and Rumsfeld want to do anyway, in order, I guess, to cover for their real purposes, but apparently they're also pretty useful at bringing in the left into their side of things.
Yeah, so has been a traditional strength of the neocons, and as you pointed out, that the neoconservatives have their origins within the left community, of the socialist initially, of the neocon forerunners, and then within the Democratic Party, that's where they came from. So they know that territory well and are better able than the old guard conservatives of forging alliances, bipartisan alliances.
And it's taking a Wilsonian kind of altruistic, bring the poor brown savages democracy and Christianity kind of argument to basically be nice wrapping paper for the naked imperialism of a Donald Rumsfeld or a Dick Cheney. Yes,
I think that's true. Although I would say that with the neoconservatives and these liberal hawks, it's not just wrapping paper. There is something to it. they actually believe that the United States has the power, the ability, the capacity to institute regime change successfully. That's a lot of pretension.
Chalmers Johnson, in his latest book, Sorrows of Empire, he goes back and talks about the Spanish-American War, and I guess particularly in discussing World War I, how Theodore Roosevelt and the progressive Republicans around him were just nakedly pro-British. We need to be just like the British. Let's create an empire. Let's kill brown people.
That's right, yes.
And how Wilson then came and, I guess pretended to be reluctant for his first term, and then once he got elected, he got us into World War I. But instead of saying, come on, everybody, let's be just like the British, he wrapped it in this kind of, which I don't think necessarily dishonestly. I think Wilson probably really believed in this kind of utopian one world order that he was going to create that was going to end wars like this for all time, and how it's what it always has been for 100 years straight. It's been the same policy with two different excuses, basically.
Yeah, and looking the difference between Roosevelt and Wilson, as you pointed out, is the way they approached imperialism. Roosevelt was in an era where it wasn't making. There wasn't a lot of making the world safe for democracy. There was territorial acquisition that Wilson repudiated that, but continued with another form of imperialism that's much like the imperialism of this administration, that it is cloaked in this democracy rhetoric. And looking back at Wilson, and as we look forward to this administration, that in his term, and there were a dozen military interventions in Latin America to make the region safe for democracy, to bring democracy to the region. Not one of those interventions or occupations resulted in democratic government.
Sure, yeah, he even invaded Mexico, right?
Yes.
Just like in Philip Drew Administrator.
Yes, there is this history. The United States has used this democracy rhetoric, and it has only been successable in mobilizing public support, both public and congressional support for these kind of interventions.
And interestingly, the idea that the neoconservatives have brought a lot of their form, even as they've changed their details as becoming quote unquote conservatives, how they've kept a lot of their form in terms of, oftentimes it's said, the Trotskyite idea of world revolution that can never stop, kind of a situation. And we have people like Max Boot, who I think is an official ex-communist neoconservative, who wrote in, I think it was in Foreign Affairs, endorsing George Bush's policy and calling it hard Wilsonianism, that we're just like the Wilsonians, only we really, really mean it.
Yes, the difference they would say is that we're not just democratizing, we're bringing U.S. military power to bear to ensure that it works. That the other democracy promotion liberals really never deal seriously with U.S. military power. We do, and therefore we can make it happen.
I got an email the other day from somebody who said they're a big fan of the show and they're really interested, and it's always about war, and they really appreciate that, but they still don't quite understand why did we invade Iraq. And I thought, here we are 2 years later, and people still don't even know why we invaded that country in the first place. Do you have an answer?
Well, there's a short answer is that and we need to restructure the Middle East, and that Iraq was the easiest target. And then the longer part of that is, why do we need to restructure the Middle East? Because we need new military bases in the region, and we need to secure the oil of the region, and that we can see. And I think that the neoconservatives have certain reason, a good reason to say that the Middle East is an area in turmoil, and that we need to insert ourselves to ensure that the region goes our way.
Our way meaning Israel's way.
That's true. If it were only, however, if it were only Israel, I don't think we'd go to the extent that we are, but it coincides with U.S. interests as well.
Yeah, this is the thing about the invasion of Iraq that, I don't know, a friend of mine put this in a real good context, and he said, listen, there's a bunch of reasons. In fact, this is even the way Bush said it. He said, listen, the reason we're invading Iraq is because it combines all of these dangers in one place. Now, quote unquote, these dangers, none of them by themselves would amount to a reason to invade a country. Okay, well, he has weapons of mass destruction. Assuming that's true, it's still not a good enough reason to invade. Well, okay, he has ties to Al-Qaeda. Well, that's not really true. But even if it was, that's still really not a good enough reason to invade. Well, you know, we got to protect our oil. We got to move our troops out of Saudi Arabia. We got to protect Israel. None of these things by themselves, if you assign them a value of a 0 or 1 as to whether it amounts to a casus belli, none of these things get a 1. They all amount to 0, but then when you combine them all, it's supposed to amount to a reason to invade.
Well, now it's being justified retroactively as that Iraq is a center for international terrorism, which indeed it may be.
Sure is now.
Yes. Yes, there's all these reasons coincide, and I would certainly agree with you that there was no good reason, and the only good reason for invading a country preemptively is if that country was planning to attack the United States. That certainly wasn't the case. And if Iran, for example, had nuclear weapons, that would not be a reason to invade Iran, that it's acquiring nuclear weapons to protect itself, and unfortunately.
In fact, Noam Chomsky, your colleague, gave a speech pretty recently, I guess a few weeks ago, where someone asked him at the end of the speech, is it ever okay to start a war preemptively? And Chomsky said, well, actually, if you want to look at it, Iran probably has the best case on earth right now, because Israel and America, not only do they, release all these trial balloons all the time about an imminent strike, not only do they blatantly lie to the cameras and accuse them of developing nuclear weapons when the IAEA and everyone else on earth says they're not, but they even talk about, we're bringing bunker buster bombs to Israel, and, everybody knows they have nuclear weapons. And with all these trial balloons and all this aggressive talk, coinciding with delivery of specialized weaponry to Israel from the United States, that if anybody has an excuse to fight war preemptively, it would be Iran. And having said that, Chomsky said, of course, no, he doesn't think that they should. But if anybody on earth really did have a case to make for preemptive war, it would be them, not us.
Well, yes, I think that's true, but just hypothetically, if the country were planning to attack the United States, that if sufficient evidence was garnered to that effect, we would have that. But that's hypothetical, and certainly why would it just probably would never occur that who would attack the United States knowing that it would be obliterated in retaliation.
Well, we just can't wait for the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. It would be too late by then, right? If Cincinnati was ashes.
Yes. That while it could be said that Condoleezza Rice is a moderate conservative, she was one of the ones who was out there saying that there was this mushroom cloud looming from Iraq, and she knew full well that that was not the case. So she's not as shrill as John Bolton, but she's willing to use that kind of rhetoric without any kind of support to make the case for U.S. policy, and it does create alarmism in the U.S. public, and that having having a high government official say that, one tends to believe it and support the administration. People don't have the time like you and I do to read more thoroughly. They just hear these little sound bites on the news and will support the administration.
Yeah, well, and they hear the little soundbite not followed by a reporter asking a follow-up question. That's what they hear is that lie by omission on the part of the reporter who says, well, but wait a minute. I mean, honestly, and I plead guilty myself. You know, I never believed for a moment that invading Iraq was justified by the slightest stretch. However, I did accept the assertions that they probably did have a stockpile of chemical weapons in there somewhere, if only because the idea, I mean, Scott Ritter notwithstanding, the idea that our government would literally blatantly lie in such a way, I mean, it seemed to many people, even their worst critics, that, well, they've got to have something. I mean, surely they're going to go in there, they're going to invade, and they're going to say, see, we told you, because they knew something that they weren't telling the IEA about or Hans Blix about, that they were going to say, see? And, you know, I even fell for that there was something, not that I thought it was a good enough reason to invade.
Yes, I think I would plead the same case that I gave some credence to it too. Although in my circles we talked about, well, even if there's going to be that if after we invade we'll plant them, we wouldn't be able to get away with this.
You know, I asked Scott Ritter why didn't they plant them, and Scott Ritter said there's just too many people too familiar with their abilities, and there's just not enough people in the CIA and the military to carry out something like that.
Yeah,
that they would have if they could have.
Yeah, that's a good answer, boss. So in the end, that it's this.
Too late. Sorry, Tom. We gotta take this break, man. We'll be right back.
Leave your guns at home, Bill. Don't take your guns to town.
All right, my friends, welcome back to the show. We're wrapping up with Tom Barry from the International Relations Center. And one of the things we're talking about in this interview is the idea that if you fail terribly in the Bush administration, you get promoted. Rice sold us a war based on lies. She's now the Secretary of State. Paul Wolfowitz created that war and devised its policy, and he's now been promoted to the World Bank. Negroponte completely failed to restore any semblance of order as ambassador to Iraq. He's now been promoted to Director of National Intelligence. Michael Chertoff, round them up by the thousands and ask questions later and then release them all because they're innocent, has been made the Director of Homeland Security. Alberto Gonzalez, you can torture them because the law doesn't apply to us, has been made Attorney General. And the next thing you know, Douglas J. Feith, the, quote, effing stupidest guy on the face of the earth, according to Tommy Franks, will be running the Federal Reserve.
I hadn't heard that. Well, it's a frightening prospect that we have. It's not only have they been promoted, that they're very tight, so that you have a very unified foreign and military and civil team here.
You could even call it a right web, couldn't you?
You certainly could. There are those links with the neoconservative organizations throughout, and so it is a unified web or assault team on what I think this country should stand for, and both in domestic and foreign policy, and that they're going to move forward with this agenda that we have been thinking, well, it can't go that far, but each time it goes a step further.
Well, and, you know, all this brings up an opportunity, you know, just like September 11th was an opportunity, according to Rice and Rumsfeld. This disastrous situation that you and I find ourselves in now is an opportunity for us, too, I think, as the neoconservatives and the liberal hawks and the traditional right-wingers all join together in the state worship party. There's a lot of us left out who I think probably don't worship the state and probably favor decentralization and peace as opposed to intervention. And there's a tremendous opportunity, I think, here for a real realignment.
I certainly agree. It's very difficult to do what the neoconservatives have done, is form a cohesive policy, bringing domestic and foreign policy together injected with values, ethics, as they say, with traditional foreign policy goals of the manipulation of power. They have been able to articulate such agenda outside of the neoconservatives. There is no one no one political force has been able to do that.
Well, I've read in a few different places where you spoke, at least pleasantly, of Pat Buchanan. I don't know if you saw him mop the floor with Sharansky on Meet the Press a few weeks back. Did you catch that?
No.
Oh, it was great. He just
imagine.
And I think, honestly, the paleo-conservatives and the libertarians and the not so much the radical, crazy Marxist types, but some of the more rational on the progressive left, like yourself and those in your organization, we can work together. I think we can.
Oh, I have no doubt about that. But there are even within our own communities of progressive, conservative, isolationists, there are these divisions on contentious issues like immigration, economic integration, and so on that make it difficult to have a cohesive agenda.
Well, maybe I think the answer is just keeping it short and simple. Against the federal police power, against foreign intervention, against corporate welfare, and then just leave out everything else. See if we can unify on those three major points.
Yes, and I'm trying to think of something that I look back at the good neighbor policy of Roosevelt, which is basically a negative policy. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. We're going to respect our neighbor and leave it there.
That's it. Sorry, okay. Tom Barry
okay,
from irconline.org. Thanks, Tom.